So this is Dave Tyra again, and I wanted to take the moment to introduce Andrea Jones. I think most people probably know Andrea. Andrea also is a former member of Morro Coast Audubon Society, and she worked out of our office for several years in Morro Bay. And Andrea is the Director of Bird Conservation for Audubon, California. So she is going to give us a presentation on protecting nature's nurseries and talking about the importance of estuaries. So Andrea, I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, thanks. Can everyone hear me? Thumbs up. Dave, if you can hear me. All right, great. Well, hi, everyone. I see a few familiar names. Hi, Jan Serby. Hi, Rosalie, and some others I remember. I was actually served on the board for 4 years as well while I lived in Morro Bay. And I'm in Ojai now, so I'm not too far away. And I was actually really looking forward to coming there and seeing you all, not having too far of a drive, but we'll have to leave that be for a little bit. So what I'm going to talk to you tonight about is Audubon's work on estuaries on the Pacific Flyway. And in a sense, Audubon, including Audubon chapters, have been involved in estuaries for a long time. But in another sense, we're building a new program and trying to elevate the status of estuaries and our protection work across estuaries in California and beyond. So I want to talk to you a little bit about what we've done and also where we're going. And, I'm not going to talk too much about Morro Bay because you guys all know Morro Bay really well. Better than I do at this point. And in fact, I noticed some of my photos of Morro Bay were outdated. So I'm going to talk more generally about estuaries across California, and I'll just touch on Morro Bay a little bit. And so Audubon's work in estuaries really spans the Pacific Flyway. We don't work everywhere, but we have chosen to work in some of the most critical places, starting up in Alaska. And I'll specifically talk about Izembek Lagoon. I don't know, is my pointer actually pointing to things right now? Okay, good. That's nice. And I'll talk a little bit about our work in Washington, Oregon, California. And I won't touch on this too much today, but we also work in Panama Bay and all the way down to Chiloé Island in Chile. And we work with local partners and actually a local chapter in Panama on these projects. And the reason we do this is because a lot of the birds that use these estuaries span the entire flyway. And I'll just give you a good example. A western sandpiper is going to be born on the west slope of Alaska. And then during migration, it's going to travel thousands of miles, hopscotching down these coastal estuaries. And there aren't really a lot of them on the Pacific coast because of the way the Pacific coast was formed. And it might end up in Panama Bay with hundreds of thousands of other shorebirds. Panama Bay is one of the most critical places on the Pacific Flyway for wintering shorebirds. And so these places, these little dots on the landscape, are really critical to protect both the birds on their breeding grounds during migration and during winter. And our work on Chiloé Island is centered around the Hudsonian godwit that winters on Chiloé Island, in particular in Chile, almost the entire population. We love our beaches. California loves its beaches. More than 80% of Californians live within 30 miles of the California coast. I'll say that again. 80% of Californians live within 30 miles of the coast. And so it's incredibly important that we protect these places, that they're open and accessible by everyone and also by tourists. But they can be loved to death. They're visited by residents as well as tourists. And the coastline, as I mentioned, is really important for tourism. This is Morro Bay, and our estuaries feed the ocean, and the ocean feeds the estuaries. And this is an example of the really rich habitats in the deep waters we have right off of our estuaries, like Morro Bay, that attract migrating shearwaters and whales and dolphins, and just this incredibly rich environment. There's nowhere quite like it on Earth. Estuaries are also really hardworking landscapes. We actually have a program in the Central Valley called the Working Lands Program, and I joke with my colleague Megan that estuaries are actually the hardest working landscape. Not only do they have to filter all the water coming out of the mountains and the rivers on its way into the ocean, they serve as ports, they have to feed us, they serve as recreation, they have to host birds during migration. They're just incredibly hardworking. And so that they have to suit all these needs for all the needs that humans and wildlife have. And the Port of Oakland is one of the biggest, it's the 5th largest port in the United States. And so right in San Francisco Bay, we have this incredibly hardworking part of the estuary. And this port was built in the 1920s. So this isn't recent times. This has been, you know, a very hardworking place for a long time. So what values do estuaries have? They have habitat values, and we'll talk more about those and some of the birds later, but eelgrass, mudflats, marshes, and open water habitats are really important. They're these very rich environments. They're places where fresh water and salt water meet, and so you get these really rich resources. They support a lot of different water bird, rail, and seabird species. They're fisheries, either nurseries or they're actually rearing fish. And so they support fishery economies as well as food for other birds and dolphins, etc. They provide a lot of recreational value. And in this picture, I happen to take in Humboldt Bay, which is has a really rich eelgrass bed. Happen to see a few kids covering another kid with eelgrass. So one of the recreational values of estuaries is that you can create eelgrass monsters. They're also resilient to climate change. We need estuaries to buffer our cities from storm surges and other impacts of climate change like ocean acidification. They also buffer pollution and sediment that's coming out of our rivers. And as I've said before, they serve a role in commerce by being the ports that take goods in and out of our cities. A recent study that came out by the Pacific Marine Estuary Partnership quantified the extent of damage and loss of eelgrass habitats in the West, starting up in Washington all the way down to Tijuana Estuary on the Baja California border down here, and found in these different ecoregions big percentage losses of estuaries and their watersheds. Overall in California, we've lost about 85% of these tidal wetland habitats. A little less in Southern California, more in Central, and that includes San Francisco Bay, and a little less up in Northern California. So this is the amount of historic loss over the last 100+ years of tidal estuarine habitat. So when you think about the West Coast, it's mostly a deep ocean, and you only have a few of these estuaries left that exist in the first place. And when you only have 15% of those left in California, and they have to support people, fisheries, birds, commerce, everything I've mentioned, that's a lot to squeeze into a few last places. What are some of the threats to estuaries? I won't go through all of these, but marine farming, is both a benefit and a threat. And I'll talk about one place where it was a threat and something we worked on. Marinas, dredging of estuaries for marinas and boats can be a threat. Fishing in some places is beneficial, in other places is considered a threat. Introduced species is a real problem. Introduced snails and non-native oysters, things like that, land clearing that create more sediment loads in these estuaries. For instance, San Francisco Bay has had a lot of sediment coming down from land clearing that started, over 100 years ago. Sediments and nutrients, that's an issue in Morro Bay from farming. So there's a lot of things that are coming into these estuaries that they have to deal with. And a more recent threat to estuaries is coastal flooding from sea level rise. And this chart shows for California, and specifically San Francisco Bay, the number of days of coastal flooding since 1950. And you can see the increase from 2005 to 2014. and the number of people that are at risk due to sea level rise. The picture here is of a gentleman in Redwood City in San Francisco Bay, whose home and all the homes around that area were flooded just last year. So we're seeing this more and more. We're seeing these storm surges. We're seeing bigger king tides, more flooding. And I hear most about it in San Francisco Bay, but I know other estuaries, including small ones in Southern California, are experiencing this increased coastal flooding. So this is sort of a risk that's added to all the other issues that estuaries have had to endure for the last several hundred years. And I don't want to dwell too much on the depressing part. I'll mention some of the birds that have really come to rely and really have evolved to use the estuary habitats. And probably the best example that relies almost 100% on estuaries is the Pacific brant. The Pacific brant are born up in Alaska, and I'll show you more pictures of this, but they're born in this whole region up in the northern Alaska up into Russia, and they migrate down through the Izembek Lagoon. And again, I'll show you a picture of that in a minute, where they stage, and then they migrate down to California estuaries all the way down to Baja. And some of the biggest numbers in the winter are down in Bahia de San Quintin, which is in Baja, California. But they use estuaries all year round, and especially in migration. And if I was there in person, I would ask you what they're eating. Well, they're eating eelgrass, and they rely almost 100% on eelgrass. They do end up eating mollusks and things that are stuck on eelgrass, but eelgrass is the mainstay of their diet. And so they're really tied to these estuaries, including Morro Bay. And likely one of the reasons there are very few brant geese left in Morro Bay is because of the loss of eelgrass. But this is just a cute picture of them up in their breeding grounds. And I should give a shout out to the hunting community, because including the Morro Bay hunters have done a lot of work to protect the breeding grounds for these birds, and ensure that there are, a lot of young coming down the Flyway. Another bird that's closely tied to our estuaries is the surf scoter. And the surf scoter breeds up in the boreal forests of northern Canada and Alaska, and then migrates down the estuaries. In fact, the majority of the wintering surf scoters on the West Coast winter in San Francisco Bay. They've estimated more than 50% of surf scoters winter in San Francisco Bay. And unfortunately, studies done in the last 10 years have shown a dramatic decline of over 80% of surf scoters. So we're actually down to less than 5,000 in San Francisco Bay. We don't entirely know why, but one of the things we need to look at is, did they go somewhere else? Are they offshore? I've seen a lot of birds in the surf off of Morro Bay in the winter. So we don't know if they spread out or why conditions aren't right for them in San Francisco Bay, but we've seen this major loss. And they are not eelgrass eaters, they are shellfish eaters. So they're in, but not only do they eat shellfish, but they also eat herring roe. And so they're closely tied to these boom and bust cycle of some of the forage fish that lay their eggs in places like San Francisco Bay. And I'll talk more about that in a minute. Osprey is a success story. Osprey are very closely tied to our estuaries in California, particularly because that's where they're, for the most part, doing their hunting for fish. And osprey were almost completely eliminated because of DDT poisoning all over the United States. And with the elimination of DDT, the fish populations rebounded, and the birds, and what was happening was their eggshells were thinning. That got fixed. These birds were protected. The same thing happened to bald eagles and others. We now have, in the last 30 years, we've gone from 0 to over 50 pairs of ospreys breeding in San Francisco Bay. So real success story for the osprey. And again, I wish I could ask you, I think maybe Judy or Dave, because I can see your faces, nod if you have ospreys breeding in Morro Bay. Not yet.
Yeah, not yet, but we have seen in our shorebird survey when we have been counting raptors, we have seen a huge increase in osprey counts in the last 3 years,
Great.
to the point that we're looking at putting up a nesting platform at Sweet Springs.
Great.
And, actually, our lands manager is working on that now.
That's really great news. Yeah, these nesting platforms are one of the reasons the birds are doing so well in San Francisco Bay. They're also nesting on cranes and buildings. You know, they've found some really unusual places to nest in San Francisco Bay, but good species to see a return. And estuaries are also incredibly important to our beloved shorebirds. And I know this is actually a picture that Mike Baird took, probably in Morro Bay. And these are least sandpipers because of the yellow legs. And sandpipers, particularly least, western, and Dunlin, migrate by the hundreds of thousands down our estuaries. They also do migrate inland through the Central Valley, and some of them visit our saline lakes. But the large majority of them are really, sorry, there's a cat trying to jump on my lap. The large majority of shorebirds are using these estuaries, and they're here in these, these brine-rich environments, picking off insects. And these birds have an incredible journey, as I mentioned before. They're coming from Alaska all the way down to Panama and beyond. And just thinking about the size of them, I looked up the weight, and they weigh about 3 marshmallows. And so this is a tiny bird, needs a lot of really rich food resources in order to complete this journey. And so these estuaries on an otherwise rocky shoreline are the places they really need to feed and fatten up for their journeys. Another bird that's really special and unique to our estuaries that has gone through a lot of declines in California as well as Arizona and Mexico is the Ridgway's rail, formerly known as the clapper rail, but the name changed a few years ago. So the Ridgway's rail is, there's 3 subpopulations in California. They're all federally endangered. There's the California Ridgway's rail that is confined now just to San Francisco Bay. And so lots of groups are working really hard to protect this bird and restore its habitat. And I'll show you an example of a project we've been doing to improve habitat for the Ridgway's rail. Unlike the other birds I've mentioned that like shorebirds that like more of the mudflat habitats, these are in the marshes. You can see in the background of this picture Salicornia, and that is the habitat that they breed in. There's another population, the Yuma Ridgway's rail, that breeds in Salton Sea. And the third one is the light-footed Ridgway's rail, which is down in San Diego and also down into Mexico. All 3 of these populations are federally endangered. And last but not least, I couldn't help but just squeeze in a little plug for the snowy plover. This isn't an estuary bird per se, but it's a reason we have snowy plovers on a lot of our coastline. Not all of our coastline, but a lot of snowy plovers breed at the mouths of these estuaries, just like they do in Morro Bay. And they're there because of the rich food resources that are coming out of the estuaries and out of the ocean. And so protecting the beaches and the beach habitats along our estuaries are incredibly important. And in some places, they actually nest, even in Northern California, on sand spits inside estuaries. So really important to think about the beach nesting birds as well as the birds in the estuaries themselves. And I want to focus a little bit on eelgrass. Audubon has thought about what our biggest contribution could be to protecting estuaries. And we've decided that a lot of our work is going to focus going forward on eelgrass habitats. And I consider eelgrass the foundation of an estuary. If your house doesn't have a good foundation, your house is going to crumble. Well, it's the same thing with eelgrass. If your estuary is supposed to have eelgrass in it and you don't have eelgrass, you're risking collapsing the entire estuary. Eelgrass serves so many different purposes. It's really hard to sell it because it's not a cute, fuzzy, snowy plover chick. but it's the foundation of a lot of things. It's important for so many commercial fisheries, including Dungeness crab and herring. It's a ecologically important species and has a lot of biophysical characteristics. It's a primary and secondary producer. It's a sediment stabilizer. So when sediment is coming down the rivers into the estuaries, the eelgrass stabilizes it and keeps the sediment in place. It cycles nutrients, including pollution that's coming down out of the rivers. And it also stores carbon, and it's being called blue carbon. So it's really holds a lot of ecosystem services. The picture in the middle here is eelgrass covered in herring eggs. And these herring eggs are what cause these massive swarms of birds like you see in the upper left picture here. And this is what we call a feeding frenzy in San Francisco Bay. And this happens typically November to January. The herring come in, lay their eggs on every surface they can, primarily eelgrass. And then gulls, cormorants, pelicans, surf scoters, everyone comes in and is feeding on this rich resource. It's a caviar at this time of year, and really important, good source of fat for a lot of different birds. So where is eelgrass in California? 5 bays support the majority of California's eelgrass. There's a really rich bed up in Humboldt Bay I'll talk about in a minute. Tamales Bay, where I showed you the picture of the eelgrass monster, that has probably the most pristine eelgrass bed in California. San Francisco Bay has the most eelgrass, but it's, boom and bust. It's had a lot of problems over time, but it seems to be on the increase right now. And then the other populations are down in Southern California, like in San Diego Bay and Mission Bay. And so what's our goal here? It's to permanently improve conditions for herring and associated water birds through science-based interventions and policies to resolve key threats. And we're doing that by protecting the habitat that, as I mentioned before, that all these things rely on, and that's the eelgrass. And I'll talk about some of our strategies in a minute, but I just again wanted to mention and show what some of the birds are that rely on this herring habitat, these herring eggs on the eelgrass, and that's scops, greater and lesser scaup, surf scoters. And then herring is a commercial fishery. It's the last commercial fishery in San Francisco Bay. However, conditions have been so bad for herring that there's been no fishery for the past 3 years. And Audubon did a really unique thing that we've never done before. We worked with the fishing industry and the state to create a fisheries management plan for the herring that would regulate how many herring could be taken in a year so that we could keep the fishery going, but also keep enough fish in the water for the birds and other wildlife. And we were really excited last year when the plan was signed into action that we couldn't actually use it because there was too few herring. We think that's related to the drought of the last 5 years, and we're out of the drought now, so we're just going to keep monitoring the situation and hope that the herring come back because it's so important for so many people and birds. Now I'll just mention a few of the places that I've talked about with some pictures showing some of these estuaries. This is Izembek Lagoon up in Alaska, and this is where about 95% of the Brant geese all stage together before they migrate. So they all gather there together, and then they begin their migration down to Morro Bay or down into Baja or wherever they're headed. And this estuary was threatened by a series of roads that were proposed to be built through it. So some of you may have seen action alerts over the last couple of years. Audubon worked really hard to fight off the roads being built in the middle of this estuary, which would have essentially split the estuary in half and destroyed a lot of habitat. So far, we've been successful in keeping development out of the Izembek National Wildlife Refuge. Next, I'll talk about Willapa Bay, which is a very remote estuary up in Washington. And Audubon Washington has been working there. The aquaculture industry functions a little bit differently in Willapa Bay. And there's a crab that's a non-native crab in Willapa Bay, and they actually spray the estuary to get rid of this crab. And they spray with neonicotinoids, which is not allowed in California. And if those of you don't know what neonicotinoids are, think lots of bees. This is a really big problem. And so our Audubon Washington staff fought, once they found out this was happening, they fought and successfully passed a new bill in Washington that prevented the relicensing of the ability to spray these pesticides in the bay. So we've essentially stopped this poison from entering the estuary, and hopefully we'll be able to keep that up. Next, I'll mention Humboldt Bay, and Humboldt Bay is one of our smaller estuaries, but I would say one of our richest. Per capita, Humboldt Bay has more birds than San Francisco Bay, but it's only a tenth the size. And I think it's because of its remote situation. It's never been industrialized, and it's incredibly rich. We estimated about 100 to 200,000 shorebirds use Humboldt Bay during spring migration. We did a study last year and found that 500,000 shorebirds use Humboldt Bay during spring migration alone. I think, I can't remember, Dave, if you were with us at a board meeting when we went up there, but yes, you were. Just an incredible place if any of you have the chance to visit it later on in the year. And it's particularly important for marbled godwits that you see in this picture, Brant geese, western and least sandpipers. Those are some of the really big numbers of birds. So it's on the sort of scale of hemispheric importance to shorebirds. And we were really blown away to find that out. And at the same time, we were discovering how many shorebirds were using the place. We were getting a new threat from a national aquaculture company, not a local company, that wanted to develop 2,000 acres of eelgrass beds into aquaculture. And you can see in this picture on the right is the structures from the aquaculture, and on the left is the undamaged eelgrass. On the right, there is no eelgrass. On the left, it's all eelgrass. So we were really concerned that because this estuary is so pristine and has so much eelgrass, that this aquaculture proposal was essentially going to eliminate almost all the eelgrass in the bay. So we sued the company with the support of Redwood Region Audubon, our local chapter, and we won. And the company was allowed to stay in existence, and we weren't trying to put them out of business. We were trying to get them out of the eelgrass into a place in the bay that was more appropriate. And so it's just like with renewable energy projects, it's about siting. So the company was able to relocate a smaller operation to a part of the bay that would have less impact on the birds and the eelgrass habitat. Audubon doesn't sue very often, but we felt like in this case, with our board approval, thank you, Dave, we felt it was the best tool we could use at the time to protect the Humboldt Bay. And San Francisco Bay, I'll go into more detail in a minute in San Francisco Bay, but Audubon does all kinds of work in San Francisco Bay, including what we're doing here, which is planting experimental eelgrass beds. And we do policy, research, and education, sort of everything, all of our tools in the toolbox we use in San Francisco Bay. And I had to throw in a picture of Morro Bay because of its importance as I'm heading south down the estuaries. And I realized as I was doing this that this is an old picture of the Overlook, because I know you've overhauled it. So I'll have to update with a new picture. And in Southern California, I can't not mention some of our most degraded estuaries in California that have oil rigs in them. Bolsa Chica, if any of you have been there in Orange County, has been restored and is an amazing place for birds. This is Los Cerritos wetlands in Long Beach, which the local Audubon chapter, El Dorado Audubon, is working incredibly hard with partners to find enough funding to restore this place. I visited it, and this is a picture I took. It's actually still has a couple least terns in there and a few fish, but it's heavily degraded and badly in need of restoration. And then one of the country's most altered estuaries, it doesn't really resemble its former self at all, is Mission Bay. And it's so altered that San Diego Audubon started a project called Rewild Mission Bay, where they're proposing to actually undo development and take out an area that's not really used anymore and return it to habitat. And so they've been working hard for many years to get the funding and the policies in place to restore a little piece of Mission Bay. So that sort of spans some of our estuaries and Audubon's work along the coast. I want to dive a little bit deeper into San Francisco Bay, because it is the largest estuary on the Pacific coast, one of the largest estuaries in the Western Americas, and supports thousands and thousands of birds, more than 500 species of wildlife. It also supports more than 8 million people. And those people need the bay. They need the bay for food. They need the bay for recreation and solace, and running and birding and whatever it might be. But they also are the causes of habitat destruction and pollution in the bay. And so it's a place where everything comes together. And it's also a place where we have this critical resource of eelgrass. But San Francisco Bay has benefited from being very progressive and doing a lot to try and restore itself. And I'll give you some examples of that. One of the best examples in San Francisco Bay of restoring the estuary is the project in the South Bay. The South Bay salt ponds were formed about 100 years ago, and they basically diked a series of tidal marsh area, former tidal marsh, to create salt. And it was owned by Cargill. And most of the Cargill ponds have now been turned back over to the National Wildlife Refuge and are under a massive wetlands restoration project. In fact, it's the second largest coastal restoration project in the United States, next to the Everglades. And so U.S. Fish and Wildlife is about a third the way through restoring 15,000 acres of San Francisco Bay. And they're restoring most of it to tidal marsh habitat for the rare ridgeways rail that I showed you earlier. And that's one of the primary reasons. They're also restoring it for fisheries, and also a little mouse that lives with the rail called the salt marsh harvest mouse, and a lot of different shorebird species. There's also snowy plovers in there. So they're restoring it for a lot of different birds, but they're primarily storing it to marshland habitat. And you can see where it's located. It butts right up against Facebook, Google, you name it. It's really in this urban hub, but incredibly important to restore that area. And by restoring it, it will also better absorb the impacts of sea level rise. And another project, so I should just back up a moment. So U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is focused mostly on tidal marsh restoration. So again, Audubon thought, well, what can our role be in San Francisco Bay? And for the most part, we've decided it's to protect eelgrass and open water habitats, because that's an area where a lot of the birds we care about live, the herring as well, and it's an area that a lot of other groups are not working. And one of the things we did, and I know this was an issue in Morro Bay, was these illegal boats that were anchored out, sometimes abandoned, sometimes lived on, in Richardson Bay, which is the northern part of San Francisco Bay. And so we set about doing a study to determine if these boats were indeed causing damage to the eelgrass beds. And so we took some drone imagery, and you can see in these pictures these circles around each boat. And a couple years ago, we counted 250 illegal boats in our biggest eelgrass bed in San Francisco Bay. And each boat had scoured out over an acre of eelgrass and created these, what we call crop circles, where they essentially damaged and destroyed these big chunks of eelgrass habitat in the bay. So we're working with the local agencies to remove a lot of these derelict boats. We're down to about 105 boats from 250. And we're looking at how we go about remediating and restoring these damaged eelgrass beds. The first thing we had to do is actually convince the local agencies that the boats were destroying the beds. They first said to us, oh, what's the damage, like an acre? And we said, no, it's more than 50 acres of eelgrass have been destroyed by these boats. And so our science really lent to the process to convince the agencies that they needed to do something about these illegal boats because they're causing a lot of damage. At the same time, it's a social issue because some of these boats are lived on by people that would otherwise be homeless. And we're sensitive to that. And so we're working with social services to rehouse the people that we need to get off the water. So it's been a project we've worked on for a few years, and we're starting to see some successes of people finding new homes off the water and hopefully eventually restoring this habitat. Another project Audubon has worked on is we've done 2 projects in San Francisco Bay that I would call demonstration projects, and we're not really in the business of restoration a lot of the time, but we like to do projects when we can do them to change policy or to experiment and learn about how habitats respond to sea level rise and climate change. And one of these projects we did was at San Pablo Bay, which is in the northeast side of San Francisco Bay. And you see this hatched area here. This is our project site. It's about 400 acres. And it's a marsh that was basically mostly dead because water was getting in the marsh and couldn't get out. And this should be habitat for the Ridgway's rail and a lot of shorebirds. So we got federal funding. We built a mile-long river basically through the middle of the marsh and a lot of rivulets to allow this marsh to breathe and drain and restore the habitat. And we wanted to do it for the Ridgway's rails. We wanted to also see how this habitat would respond because the refuge was actually having to spray this refuge with insecticides because there were so many mosquitoes there. And we thought, a wildlife refuge shouldn't be aerially spraying itself. And so by eliminating ponding water, we could eliminate the need to spray. And the last thing we wanted to look at is, could we create this in a way so that it could deal with the impacts of sea level rise? So while we were building the stream through the middle of this marsh, we were taking that mud, putting it along the edges of the marsh and creating a transitional habitat and islands, basically what we call high tide refuge. So as water comes in, the birds can actually march out of the water. And that's really important for rails because for some reason they won't really fly when water's coming at them. They need to be able to walk out of the water. And so by creating these upland areas along the edges of the marsh, there are places the rails can actually walk out of the water when it's flooding. And I hope this works. Judy, I can see your face, so maybe you can give me a thumbs up if it starts. This is a little video, and I'm just going to show you a couple minutes because when we built this project, cost $3 million of federal funding, a really extraordinary thing happened. Okay, good. I'm just going to let this play for a couple minutes. I won't show you the whole thing. In this video, we're out at Sonoma Creek Marsh, which is Audubon's restoration project at the San Pablo Bay National Wildlife Refuge. And what Courtney Gutman was looking at here was a large group of migratory shorebirds. And the shorebirds are here because they're resting and they're feeding. They probably just arrived back from their breeding grounds in Alaska. It's a mixture of Dunlin, western sandpipers, and least sandpipers most likely, and there's thousands upon thousands of birds. You can see some of what we're calling the marsh mounds and the transition zones that we've built into the marsh. And these provide high tide refugia for birds during high tide events and also sea level rise. Now you may wonder why these birds are wheeling around the marsh the way they are instead of settling down onto the ground. And that's because there's a northern harrier that's come in and it's looking to pick off one of these birds for its lunch. Okay, I'm going to try and go to the next slide here if this works. I would love. Oops. Sorry, technical challenges all of a sudden. Okay, we'll just go to the next slide. Okay, so that was just showing a little bit of what happened in San Pablo Bay. Once we started to let the marsh drain and these mudflats got exposed, we just saw these incredible migrations of shorebirds coming in. We've also seen an increase in the number of rails breeding in the marsh, so it's been a really great success. The project also changed policy in San Francisco Bay by allowing bay fill to be used to create these upland areas for migrating birds. The last project I just want to mention briefly is in Richardson Bay, Aramburu Island. There was a dredge spoil island that was built in Richardson Bay, basically to protect the homes you see off here, and create a boating area for these houses for the boats to get out into the bay. And it was basically just this weedy, nasty island with nothing on it. And so we set about, could we turn this into habitat with oyster shells? We imported oyster shells, and we grew native plants, and we restored this 15-acre habitat. And we wanted to build it in a way where we could see if it wouldn't wash away, if it could be built so that it would be able to mitigate the impacts of sea level rise. And we built this about 10 years ago, and we're still studying it. But after about the first 2 years on our oyster beds, we had the first pair of black oyster catchers nesting in Richardson Bay ever, at least in recent history. And we've got lots of terns, elegant terns loafing on the island, and we can continue to study the geology of the island and how it's responding. But I would say overall it's been an incredible success project. It's a place we've brought thousands of volunteers to help us pull weeds and plant native plants. So just in summary, I've mentioned to you some of the projects we're already doing in San Francisco Bay and ways we want to expand. Our estuary program, which is really a growing program at Audubon, California, is a program where we envision coastal ecosystems that provide high quality habitat for birds and foster coastal resilience for communities. Because so many people live near and enjoy estuaries, we can't ignore people and the impacts to people from their people, and communities are really at the front line of sea level rise in these estuaries. So we want to come up with solutions that work for both the communities and the wildlife in these areas. And we're doing this through science. We'll be developing models to look at how and where eelgrass should be grown and restored in estuaries, looking at what parts of every bay are the best places to grow eelgrass, considering climate change impacts. We'll be working with communities on coastal planning for sea level rise and estuary protection, and a lot of that work will be done in partnership with the local Audubon chapters. And we're planning to create a system of coastal advocates so that up and down the coastline, people know how to respond to threats to their coastline. And to that end, I just wanted to mention a little bit about policy I think this is my last slide. One of the things we're working on, in addition to working with chapters and being on the ground, thinking about how to restore and protect estuaries, is making sure the state is paying attention to the estuaries. And we were really excited this year because Newsom's administration were really interested in working on protecting estuaries, and created 2 bills that would have provided millions of dollars in coastal resources to estuaries. Morro Bay could have benefited from this money. Any estuary could have applied for this money. There are 2 bills being sponsored in California. As you may all be aware now, because of COVID-19, basically all these bills are dead. And so they're not going to go anywhere this year. There's a chance the sea level rise bill might, but it won't have any funding attached to it. All funding for any of these projects has been taken away and is being used to combat COVID. So the good news is the interest is there and the language is there, and we can pick this back up next year. And typically at this point, I would promote our advocacy day in early June in Sacramento. Well, we're doing it online this year. So stay tuned, because we're going to have one day focused on the coast. I don't know what day it is, but it's going to be the first week of June. And it's a day for our chapters to get together and talk about how to protect our coastline. We'll have guest speakers, elected officials on these webinars with us. And we will still be advocating for our coastline, but we'll just be doing it in a remote way. So with that, I'll turn it over to any questions. Thank you.
So this is Dave. If you have a question for Andrea, go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question.
So Andrea, I had a question about the Willapa Estuary and the crabs where they were spraying neonicotinoids for the crabs. So can you talk just briefly about what the damage those crabs have done and what their alternative is at this point instead of the neonicotinoids?
Oh, that's, it's a project a colleague of mine worked on, so I don't know much about it. And in fact, it was a shrimp, now that I think about it. It was a burrowing shrimp it basically drills into the side of the oysters. And so it kills the oysters, and so they were spraying it. And I'll have to get back to you on that, because I don't know what they're doing instead of that, in order to protect the oysters that they need to protect.
Okay, thanks.
This is Rosalie. You mentioned Microsoft and Facebook. No, you didn't mention Microsoft. Google up there in the Bay Area. And
Yeah.
I'm just wondering, are they helping in any way?
They've helped a little bit. Actually, no, they helped. Facebook in particular helped in kind of a big way. I didn't mention this, but a few years ago, we passed a parcel tax in San Francisco Bay that's providing $200 million for restoration over 50 years. And Audubon with its chapters were some of the biggest advocates to get that passed. I mean, it was a bond measure and it needed to be passed by 2/3 vote. And Facebook supported us in that and did a lot of publicity, including hosting events to get people to vote in favor of that parcel tax. So that was one thing that they did. Google has worked with Santa Clara Audubon on creating native habitats for birds on their campus, and they've turned their campus to a walking-only campus. I think walking and bikes. So they've done a few things. But, I'm not aware that they've done a lot. I actually wish they would do more than they have done, but they have done a few things. Google does have an environmental grant program. And as I said, they've given money to both Audubon, California and Santa Clara Audubon to work on bird habitats.
Google.
Google did that, a couple years ago.
I have a statement, not necessarily a question. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, this is all new to me. Walking out in Montana Dare on the cliffs, and the ranger was spraying a non-native species of plant and I asked her what it was, and it was Roundup. And she was like 6 feet from the cliff. And those are some cliffs that I've spent some time counting the cormorants and other shorebirds. And I was just appalled. So I didn't know that our state parks were spraying Roundup.
They do, and it's very controversial. I've got my own personal opinions about it, which are not to do that. In most cases, there are ways to do it.
It's called weeds. We could all go pull a weed.
Yeah, well, so one of our sanctuaries, we avoid any use of herbicides by hand pulling. And using, mechanical means like weed whackers and things like that. Some places, there's almost no alternative to Roundup, but there's ways to do it where you're not actually spraying, you're painting instead. So, state parks does do that. I would suggest you write to the local district and complain, because there's plenty of instances where they really don't need to be doing that, especially near a water source.
Thank you.
I just wanted to say something.
Hi.
Just before the meeting, I was at San Simeon Beach, and all the sandpipers were there, and the wind was really blowing hard. But, I've gone on walks at Hearst State Beach, and I've seen the sandpipers.
This is April, and so this is prime migration for the sandpipers.
Yeah.
So they're actually coming back from places like Panama, stopping in. They're headed north to Alaska to breed, and April is one of the biggest months for shorebird migration. So whether you're on a beach or a cliff or an estuary, now's a really good time to go out and see the shorebirds when you can see some of the biggest numbers.
They're wonderful.
I have a question. What is the impact of oyster beds on eelgrass? We have oyster beds in our bay, and has been discussion of increasing those beds.
Yeah, so from what I understand, I don't know a lot about the Morro Bay beds. I've heard, I've talked to the estuary program, and they're not, as far as I know, they're not overly concerned with them. There's different types of oyster beds, and the ones in Morro Bay are floating, which is much less impact. The ones in Humboldt Bay, they were actually stationed onto the bottom of the bed. And the way that Humboldt Bay works is that this eelgrass really gets exposed at low tide, and the beds were right on top of it, so it basically just shaded and killed it. But the oysters are grown in a very different way in Morro Bay, and the scale is so small in Morro Bay, and I don't believe it's where the eelgrass is either. So it's a completely different situation than the type of aquaculture they were doing in Humboldt Bay, which is much more damaging.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Oh,
Any more questions?
Yes, will a recording of this be available, and will there be a link for folks that weren't able to join tonight?
Yeah, we have to this is all new to us, to Morro Coast Audubon. This is our first Zoom community. I have to say, we at the time that our peak, I think we had 45 participants.
nice.
So that's really good, and I'm really happy with that. So I'm hopeful that we can go forward. I'm working with the person that was projected to be the speaker for May. I was kind of waiting to see how this went, and so since it went so well, I think we'll see if we can do it again for our May program. So we'll figure out, I've got the recording, we'll figure out how we can get it up, and then we'll publicize the link to it.
Excellent.
And if anyone would like to reach out to me, I should have put this up here, but my email is very easy. It's ajones@audubon.org. So if anyone has any last questions or wants to reach out, just send me an email.
Maybe you can type that into the chat, Andrea.
Oh, yeah, I can do that.
And the reminder was really helpful because I'd forgotten.
Yeah, thank you, Joanne, for doing that.
Okay, I'm trying to find the chat and I can't find, oh, there it is. Here we go. Okay, there's my email address.
Great, thanks.
Okay, Judy, did you have anything you wanted to finish with?
Oh, you're muted, Judy.
Oh, are you there, Judy?
There we go.
Okay.
Thank you all for coming, and thank you, Dave, for putting this up, and thank you, Andrea, for agreeing to do this remotely. This is great.
Andrea, this went really well. Thank you so much.
Well, it's always, it's always nerve-wracking on these things, but I'm glad to see it actually worked out.
You did great.
Thank
Okay.
you.
All right. Thank you, everybody. Thank you for participating, and we hope to try and do this again soon. So I'm going to sign off now.